My story began with a death sentence.
My beginning is before AIDS.
She talked about this new disease. It was going to change the face of medicine in South Africa.
Very few of us had any understanding of the epidemic.
Really, I had absolute, complete faith in the fact that, science would prevail.
When the epidemic first came, I thought it really didn't concern us. It was a problem of white gay males in California, and that was a dreadful mistake because, as you've seen, from the 80s, we've become the worst affected country in the entire world.
We had HIV. We didn't have the drugs at that stage.
The drugs haven't arrived.
Who could afford to be on the antiretrovirals? And you were talking about $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
We had this real view that there was new hope. I think we were all a bit patient. We were saying, Mbeki comes to power and we need to allow him a bit of time to bed down. Same was true for Mantu.
What I kept hearing was, you wanted a policy on treatment, you've got it.
Some of the memories I have is of a lot of people dying, a lot of friends dying, personal confrontations that I had which were unpleasant with the former Minister of Health.
It was already known that the infection in children can be prevented, and yet they were still dragging off feet.
There was a bit of conflation of the issues. We then got into a bit of a debate which polarized us as a country.
As we grew, AIDS denialism hardened. As it hardened, we had to fight it harder. As we fought it harder, Thabo Mbeki, being a proud and arrogant man, hardened his position further, and unfortunately we got into a kind of, I think, vicious spiral.
There were very few people who supported us fighting Thabo Mbeki. And within the government itself, if there is a handful I can think of who stood up, it's a lot.
From an international perspective, we were embarrassed.
Bearing in mind that it's always been the case that an effective response will have to be a national response.
What moved and inspired and motivated you in those days was the personal interactions with people.
I think it's right to capture this history.
Started for me, and I was head of pediatrics. Started around 89, because you see, first women had to get infected before children got infected, and then they just took over all the wards, pediatric wards. By the time I left my position, about maybe 70% of the patients were HIV/AIDS, and for much of that time, we just didn't have antiretrovirals or proper care.
What did you? What were you thinking at the time? Did you have any ideas? Could you project? Could you predict what was going to happen?
No, not at all. Not at all. But you must remember, I had been through the anti-apartheid struggle, so I had grown up in understanding the broader context of medicine, and had been involved in all that. I wasn't only involved in the political struggle, but also the medical struggle for equal health, etc. And I was working in a black hospital. Most of those patients were African black, and they were nearly always poor. And we had the contrast of the white hospital, which is Addington on the beachfront, and many other hospitals. So the experience of that discrimination of, for example, knowing that if we had the facilities in the white hospitals, the kids who I was looking after, who may have been desperately and acutely ill, but if they had access to intensive care for a night, 2 nights, they would have survived. And to give you a practical example, we used to have a lot of measles in those days. It's much less common now. It's been almost wiped out by the vaccine. But measles causes the upper respiratory tract here, your trachea, to get blocked. And all you need to do is really pass a tube down and let them breathe, and in about a day or two, they're good as new. But if you don't have those facilities, which we didn't, they died. So it was that sort of experience. So I had grown up like that, and I had grown up knowing about kwashiorkor and marasmus, and I wasn't entirely unaware that all I was doing was patching up by treating them in hospital, because they get over the acute attack and you send them back into the same awful environment from which they got the problem in the first place. The poverty, the lack of food, the infections, the difficulties, the lack of employment, the whole lot of symbols of apartheid poverty. So, you know, that was the basis of my experience. So this, in a way, it's not fair, but in a way it was almost an extension of that. Oh, once again, black children are not going to get it. And it's not a question of black and white children, it's a question of black children and children in the developed world. So I felt it, but in a way I'd not been immune, but I'd been accustomed to the scale of those problems before. When the epidemic first came, I thought it really didn't concern us. It was a problem of white gay males in California. Here I was treating black kids in South Africa. I thought it's nice to know, why should I particularly care about the AIDS epidemic? And that was a dreadful mistake, because as you've seen, from the 80s, we've become the worst affected country in the entire world.
Well, the spread was just so incredibly rapid. I'm just checking the chronology here. Were you involved with NACOSA at all? NACOSA?
In a way.
There was a meeting in Maputo, wasn't
That's
it?
the one. Yeah. Oh no, Maputo we organized. Okay. Oh no. I remember I told you we had anti-apartheid health organization.
Yes.
So I was central to that. Me and some of my colleagues. And one of the bigger one was called NAMDA, National Medical and Dental Association, NAMDA. And there was another one called PPHC, Progressive Primary Healthcare. So both of them were formed by us. And what happened was we had many solidarity groups in the US, the UK, a few in Europe, in health. And we thought we needed a conference on what looked like to be the first few years before apartheid changed or was transformed. And we couldn't have it in this country because we had a lot of exiles, we had people from outside. And so we had it in Maputo. I'll never forget that conference. And Maputo was really weak in terms of infrastructure.
Yes.
Absolutely weak. But it was, the ANC was there. But it was a really powerful meeting because it brought all of us together. And I remember writing the declaration, which I had to read out at the end of the conference. And there's a friend of mine called Jack Geiger. You probably don't know him, but he's an American physician, belonged to the Physicians for Human Rights and worked in the South, primary care for black Americans. So he and I wrote that declaration after all those discussions and debates. But it was a great meeting. It was a precursor to NACOSA, which came later. But that meeting, which hasn't been sufficiently acknowledged. I think most of the ANC people think that it didn't happen. Like many of the other things they think didn't happen.
It was Virodine.
I know that well.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that.
Tell me about Virodine. What do you remember about Virodine?
I remember a lot about it. I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting in our kitchen and a friend phoned me and said, put on your TV, and I did. And there was this announcement that South African scientists had found the cure for AIDS, some words to that effect. So then, there was a train of events, because since we'd been in the forefront of this health struggle and partly the political struggle, immediately found out, we Googled these authors who had discovered the Virodine, knew they had never published. It was a farce. manifestly a farce. They'd never published on anything before. Suddenly to come up with a cure for AIDS when the rest of the world is, and from Pretoria, which had no particular track record, so it was totally bizarre. And to make matters worse, Thabo Mbeki paraded these people in front of our cabinet. And the cabinet, Lord bless their souls, they gave them a standing ovation. You know, it just shows how nutty they were. So I must say it left an indelible mark in my memory of that period when science was beginning to be trashed. That was the beginning of it. And that was really the start of the problems we had with Thabo Mbeki and the Medicines Control Council, which was being run by a colleague of mine. I just forget his name. He was a wonderful man. He was a head of pharmacology from UCT. What's his name? Anyway, Thabo asked him to endorse or register this industrial solvent, and he of course turned it down. And then when Thabo got onto his binge about the toxicity of antiretrovirals and all, she supported it. So I won't forget those days. I'll never forget it. I was directly involved. I was the chairperson of the AIDS 2000 conference. And I remember Helen and some of her colleagues from the MCC came to close down one of the commercial stands because they were advertising this drug, nevirapine, which Thabo had said was a poison, etc. And I nearly lost my head with her for being the agent of a government which was trying to do such a thing.
So this was someone you knew, a colleague of yours who
Absolutely.
became an agent. Why do you think that happened? I mean, why did people align themselves
Good
with
question.
Mbeki in the distance?
I mean, Helen, I'd rather not, because she's speaking at this conference, and I don't want to be too offensive. But that's history. She was part of that, and that has to be ignored. Don't pretend now to me that you are fighting for freedom, because that was important. But it also bears on my subsequent experience on a similar issue. Then you remember Thabo came out with his idea of having a meeting of the minds between the denialists and what he called as conventional or traditional scientists. And I was part of that for a while, not because Thabo appointed me, but the people there asked that I should be part of it. The reason I'm mentioning it is on the same tack on which you're asking me a question. Then it became a sort of a contest between science, which I was trying to represent, and Thabo Mbeki and his distorted version of what reality is about the cause of HIV/AIDS and all of that, and drugs, etc. And you must remember, I was not only in the medical struggle, I was in the political struggle. I was on the executive of the United Democratic Front. I had been working 10 years here in community groups with the Natal Indian Congress, which was the remainder of the old Congress Alliance. So I had many friends in Parliament at that time. Many of the ministers were colleagues who had fought with me in the struggle. And I kept asking them, what's wrong with you guys, How can you believe the stride that Thabo is trotting out? And I knew them, they were brave, they were willing to die for the struggle, and I know that. And many of them were tortured and all that. And comes independence, and they kowtow to this madness of Mbeki, And I remember the classic example was Kader Asma. Do you know he was Minister of, Water or something? We meet at a party and talking across the table. Ask him, Thabo, Kader, you must, I know him very well. I stayed in his house in Dublin. I've known him for a long time. I said, you were the Dean of Law. You must know Thabo is talking utter nonsense. You're not illiterate. And he said, no, that is true. But what can I do? He doesn't listen to anybody. He's authoritarian. He doesn't entertain any opposing views, etc. And I remember his words. He said, "What do you want me to do? Do you want me to resign from the cabinet?" And I didn't tell him, but I thought, yeah, it'd be a good idea if a couple of you guys resigned on principle. You guys are not starving for money. He's on a dean's pension. So what do you need? What do you need to hang on to a disreputable cabinet like this? You've destroyed the 10, 20, 100 years we've fought for freedom by these sorts of actions. Anyway, so the point was that there were very few people who supported us fighting Thabo Mbeki. And within the government itself, if there is a handful I can think of who stood up, it's a lot. None of them stood up. I know clearly. In fact, we wrote on that. We wrote about that because I was speaking at some UK conference, and they asked me to write these experiences. So we published that too. And it was quite astonishing that in a modern society in the latter part of the 20th century, first part of it, that an anti-scientific campaign, which is almost medieval in its concepts of science, is allowed to take place, and as we've subsequently learned, cost hundreds of thousands of lives. You know, they calculate more than 300,000 adults. How many children? How many mothers? How many people suffered? How many people didn't get cured? It's almost genocidal in its scale. So the real point I want to make is it was a lonely period. There were very few of my old friends in Parliament who ever stood up and said these people, this one or two people are right. And I must tell you, even in the scientific world, it's not as if everyone in Wits and Cape Town and at Bloemfontein were helping us along. They were not. Everyone kept silent. So I felt mostly that my political friends who had now been appointed as ministers and so on just didn't speak up. And so when you ask why, that's why. They simply had got the fruits of power, and as you see now what's happened to the ANC, who are totally corrupted by that power. That's what happened within the space of, what was it, 5-6 years. It was simple as that, and banal as that. Our country's been influenced a lot by these messianic figures like Mandela. So in that case, it was a positive thing that at least we didn't explode into a catastrophic period of violence, and we got more or less peaceful transition. And the same thing happened with Thabo Mbeki. I mean, his influence was on this issue was quite massive. It really was, and
his expertise.
And his and the view that people thought he was within the ANC, they considered him to be an intellectual. Well, that's debatable, but anyway, my view of intellectuals is different from theirs. So they thought, this man says it, and then he must be right. But he wasn't right, and it caused a lot of trauma. I often wondered why that was so, which is an answer to your question. Why? So that's what we wrote about. Remember I told you we wrote. And I followed closely, asking that guy. No, he's not stupid. I mean, this man, he's not stupid. He loves some things I love. I love poetry too. He loves poetry. He trained in the United Kingdom. He loves some of those parts of the West which are wonderful about its culture, its literature and music. So there's a lot of things I share with him. But I think in his case, his ego and his fundamental Africanism overrode his understanding of the problem, overrode the nationalism. And there were 2 or 3 classic examples of speeches he made, where it came out clearly what the problem was. There was one was made at the old Fort Hare. He was speaking to what obviously he thought was a predominantly African black audience. And he said to them words to the effect like, who do they meaning what? Whites, Western, or something like that. Who do they think they are? Who do they think we are? Do they think we are animals? Do they think we cannot restrain our animal impulses? Do they think we are bearers of disease? And he said he did that a couple of times, you know. And more importantly, he and his cronies somehow published a booklet called, it had a bizarre title.
Geese.
Eh? Peter Mokaba released it.
Yeah, it was Geese
and Castro, about, or what was it?
Yeah, no, I know.
You remember that?
Yes, yes.
So anyway, there was that book, same story, same ridiculous, untenable and illogical arguments, same thing. And I think the interpretation of that, and I don't agree with other people who said that he was worried we didn't have money. I think that's nonsense. I think what it was this deep psychological throwback to the colonial period. I mean, what he was saying is in colonial years, the justification for colonialism, as everyone knows, you know, anyone who read any of that literature at that time, that blacks, you know, you people are barbaric. You don't have traditions, you don't have culture. So, you know, you at a lower scale of civilization than us. And so and part of that was your sexual impulses and your sexual propensities are, you don't curtail them. Here we get independent. The first major disease is, in his eyes, rooted in the shame of sexual promiscuity. That's what it is. So he says, how does he face it? I mean, here it's not that the white man was right or colonials were right, but it just happened to be a coincidence of global problems. And I think that's what he couldn't face. He couldn't face the fact that what apparently was epithet thrown to blacks in the colonial years was, in his eyes, coming true in the first years of democracy. He couldn't accept the shame of that. That to me was the most powerful influence. There are other influences, obviously, but I think that was the most powerful one. It's the only logical one I can think of. I don't think, some people thought, well, he thought, let these people die, you know. We don't have money to treat everyone. It's too cynical for me. There were other reasons also. It's a good question you asked. So remember, at that time, I was the chair of the International AIDS Conference. And all the world had paid attention to what Thabo and them were saying. And there was quite a bit of violence in the country at the time, as there is now. So there were lots of threats from Westerners. We don't want to come to South Africa, that sort of thing. Because, you know, first of all, look at that crazy government. And so in this so-called colloquium or dialogue between the dissidents and us, they appointed the dissidents, and then they asked some of the South African scientists. I wasn't one of them. So when that group met, the South Africans suggested that I come and present the case of science, or why we think. And so we met in Pretoria. And you're right to ask that question, but it was not possible to talk to these people. You say something scientific and they cannot argue that way because they don't translate reality in that by that particular method. Science is nothing if not being a method. It's a method of looking at reality. And so in the first day I was there, you know, we were getting into these fights and talking past each other. And I'll never forget, at tea time, there was an American chap whose name I forget now, you know, but he was one of... Not the Duisberg. Duisberg was a quieter guy. There was another more voluble character. He was a social scientist. But he came up to her and kept pestering me about, you know, you guys are not right or something. And I was a little wilder then, and I saw him. And I turned him F off or something. And I thought, my God, and there were cameras there. And I said, God, you know, I'm the chairman of this conference. If somebody catches me speaking like this, they're going to be very upset. So I said, I better leave, and I left, and I went home. The others continued, and it ended up as a damn squib. I mean, it continued in some form or shape, and there was some alleged studies done, but it was a, I mean, it was a major, major blot on the South African society, because we allowed a president to defy science and logic and reason, and present us in such a bizarre and backward light to the rest of the world.
And in a way confirming so many prejudices about
Africa. Black people.
Yeah.
He just did the worst possible thing, you know, really. His ego, his sense that he knew the answers to everything, that he was an intellectual, you know. I think I work by my mind. But don't ask me to run a nuclear station or something. What do I know about those things? And the world is too complicated, you know. I'm supposed to be, much of all my research is on AIDS. But it's in a narrow field of it. Don't ask me about aspects of AIDS. The fields are too big. And I think he simply did not understand science. He was literally illiterate about science. He thought science, think of Thabo. He lives here. He goes to London. He trains in Sussex. He gets a master's in economics or something. It's not a PhD, it's a master's. Then he tours around the world as sort of the foreign minister of the ANC. And what's his job? His job is to sort of negotiate between opposing points. That's his whole life, negotiation. And it comes to its absolute high point when he negotiates between the Afrikaners here and the ANC in one of those West African countries. I forget whether it was Senegal or somewhere there. That was the height of that negotiation. So he thinks all truth can be obtained by negotiation. You know? You believe X and you believe the sun rises from the north. So let's argue. But science doesn't work that way. Otherwise we would have never discovered DNA. DNA doesn't go around by consent. You do a laboratory experiment, you find the thing, you get a Nobel Prize. That's how it works. So I think he simply didn't understand it and thought his political upbringing, his political experiences had limited his vision of ways of arriving at the truth.
The health minister.
Oh, she's...
Minister Mantu Chabalala Msima. A bit wild.
Yeah, she was the ugly face of Thabo Mbeki. She really was. I didn't take her seriously because she was so utterly ignorant, so totally stupid, and so obdurate and offensive. And did I know her? I knew her well. You must remember, I was with my cousin was in the treasury of the ANC in London. So when I used to go and stay at his house was paid for by the ANC. I knew Thabo and them from those days, other than my involvement in the struggle here. So I knew, and I knew her. She was the wife of, what's his name, Mendy Msimang, who was quite a hot shot in the ANC in London. And my cousin used to fetch her. He was in the treasury also. So I knew her from them. I knew her. And then when she came back, I also knew her. It's not that I didn't know her. And I think she joined that PPHC which we had formed, you know. By that time we had moved on to other things. But my main contact with her was at this AIDS conference, not the South African, the international one, held in this ICC. And so at that time the noise against South Africa was rising to a crescendo all over the world. And there's a wonderful document called the Durban Declaration, which we had started and was signed by I don't know how many thousand scientists and about 10 Nobel laureates and so on and so forth. So it was really pitching science against this medieval view. And she represented that medieval view. Anyway, but she was here at the conference. And then she called me on the penultimate night, which is the next day was the last day. And Mandela was going to close the conference, which he did. So she summoned me to her room. There's a Hilton Hotel. And she asked that I bring along the Slim Karim, who's in charge of the science program. I'm chairman, he's the science. So we went to that room and she was there, and there were a number of her recently appointed provincial medical health, like health ministers for the province. They are called MECs. 7 or 8. I knew them all because most of them qualified with me. They were my students. So I knew many of them. Anyway, she was there with about maybe 5, 6 of them and her. And they started discussing. They said they're really offended by this international attack on the integrity of South Africa. That was offending them. And her request wasn't framed in a way of request, was she wanted to speak in the plenary the next day. That's the last plenary. She wanted to speak at the plenary to answer all these critics of South Africa. So I said, you know what, I think I was much braver then than I am now. As you grow older, you get less and less brave. But this I wasn't going to let that happen. I wouldn't allow it, simply wouldn't allow it. It was just wrong. I explained to her, maybe you don't know how a science conference is run. What happens is I'm a chairman. That doesn't mean I'm God or authority, not like how you politicians act. We decide who should go in a plenary and speak, and it's a huge honor. International plenary on AIDS, you have to really have deserved that place. And you choose, about 4 of the top scientists in the world with the most important things to say. That's what people come to listen to. And we did this collectively. You want me now to allow you to go there and speak? They'll kill me. And forget kill me. What integrity will I have? What dignity will I have left the next day if I appear to be a political hack? I'm not a political hack. I fought for freedom. I didn't fight for people like you to come and tell me to do this. So she got very upset and she said, you're not a loyal citizen. I am pretty loyal, I told her. You were in London, I was here. My house got bombed. I was fighting every day. And not because I'm a doctor, so I was fighting the political struggle. We were going around mobilizing the masses when you were sitting in London. So don't talk to me about loyalty. It was that sort of conversation. So anyway, I told her there's no way I'm going to do that. You do what you want, I'm not going to do it. I don't care who you are. So then her final words are really inscribed on my brain. Her final words were, your international friends will be gone tomorrow. And then there'll be you, and then there'll be me. And we will see. So that's how it ended. And from that point on, that's 2000 until she died. She never spoke to me again. She never invited me. Not that I'm the best scientist or anything, but I do know something about mother-to-child transmission. I have a view. I'm literate on AIDS. Never invited me to any committee, anything of the sort. I was just totally isolated. And many of us were in that. So I remember because we sponsor these AIDS conferences, I was inevitably caught up in welcoming state guests, and she was a guest once or twice, but there was absolutely no contact. I remember James McIntyre from Joburg, who was standing with me once. He put out his hand to shake her hand. She swept past him in total contempt. That's the sort of woman she was. Even her sickness was a perversion of what medical health care should be. She obviously skipped and jumped queues to get a liver transplant. And they lied about the cause of the disease, I'm pretty sure. So, to me, she was an utter disaster. And there are people who knew her from Botswana, and she had a rather shady career there too. She's just, in terms of ministers of health, she's such a parody of one that you can't believe that South Africa, which had such great people in the struggle for freedom. I can't tell you how those of us growing up held the ANC. To me, they were like the ultimate leaders. Mandela and Joe Slovo, Yusuf Dadu and Sisul, the whole lot of them. We never even questioned them. If they told us to jump, we would have jumped. That's how high a regard we had for them. Of course, when we got to know them and people like this appeared, they destroyed, it's an exaggeration, but they destroyed to some extent our image of that 100 years of our history. So it is more than just the insult to the country or to us. I think there is, because even within the Department of Health, when Motsoaledi was first appointed, so we had met him, and he indicated that really it's difficult for him, because the legacy of Mantu Shabalala was still there amongst his staff. We couldn't fire all of them. And so it was there in the staff. And when Thabo had started his questioning of drugs and the science of HIV, you must remember we came out of a totally undemocratic and an oppressive and authoritarian environment all our lives. That's how we grew up. I never understood the meaning of presidential power. And when Thabo said X about AIDS, it just swept through the whole political and bureaucratic and civil services in this country. So everyone had to echo that line. So there were people here, let's say in the municipality, whom I would know personally and so well, and municipalities all over, who wouldn't dare do a thing contrary to the prevailing view. So if there was a question of giving a life-saving antiretroviral and we had access to them, they would never support. They wouldn't support anything.
The messages were so pervasive and so
absolutely
and paralyzing.
Very much. And I don't think you are right about. She didn't she didn't plant people. It wasn't It wasn't fascism. Hey, I would imagine under fascism you just plant your. No, this is more subtle. It's the immense power of political control, I think, in a rapidly or newly transforming country, which is coming out of experience of a black-white struggle, basically. And if the chief says such is such, that's what is believed all the way down. So even now, in these recent municipal elections, the ANC can do what it likes. There'll be protests and killings and murders and total upheaval. People will vote for the ANC. Because it's hard to get rid of 100 years of history. Eh? Hard to get rid of the image of Mandela still. And therefore, I think people will vote. But that's not it's not a parallel. It's a parallel thing that when the president said this, it just swept through the whole country. So you found nobody, very few people, sorry, not nobody, who would oppose that view in government, and very few people who were willing to speak out.
So it was sort of slogan-based medicine instead of evidence-based medicine.
Not evidence whatsoever. We in fact, who was it? So early on, I thought, Mbeki must be being misled by some science advice. So we wrote a letter to him. So we wrote to him and said, listen, Mr. President, this is a private letter. We're not publicizing it. But you know us, You can't say we are reactionaries or so. All of us have sacrificed for the struggle, we fought. So we're really worried that you're getting these bizarre messages about HIV/AIDS. So won't you allow us to come and speak to you and maybe assist you in finding the right scientist to speak to? So it was hardly 10 lines. And I wish I had kept that letter, his reply. I do regret losing it somewhere, because the others they were not scientists, so they sent it to me to reply to us. And it was the most astonishing document. And it was worthy of a child who didn't understand scientific evidence whatsoever. So he writes about 10 pages. He says, well, you know, I'm not doubting your people's integrity and things, but what must I do with this evidence I find? I Googled nevirapine, for example, and I find it causes liver failure, and you telling me it's safe. So where did you find that? Oh, there was a case report, let's say, in the Lancet. Or I did this, and I Googled that, and I found that these other drugs also can cause your white cell counts to fall. Of course it does, for heaven's sake. Don't you know penicillin can kill you tomorrow? But you work on a basis of benefits and costs, side effects and benefits. You treat cancer, but you know, your hair falls, and my God, you know, you can have a problem. But it gives you life. I'm a diabetic, I take drugs, they have side effects, but I'm still alive, otherwise I'd be dead. He has no concept that there are these trade-offs in science. You know? Everything you do is a balance between benefit and disadvantage. So he gave me this whole list of, what's the word, I mean, juvenile arguments about how drugs. That tells you how he thinks. He thinks he could sit on the internet, and any fool will tell you these days the internet is a wonderful instrument, but it's a dreadful instrument if you don't know how to use it. I mean, you can't believe everything that he just believed everything, so obviously. So I think that was his fundamental flaw, the ego, the absence of a scientific basis to his thinking. The German, Rath.
Yeah, break
Rath.
the chains of
Rath.
pharmaceutical colonialism, Matthias. Did you ever meet him?
No, he sued me for R500,000 because I was closing one of these conferences, and I said, you know, our world is surrounded by these charlatans and criminals who are trading in on human misery. Something like that. I forget what I said. But anyway, he sued me. But then he withdrew at his cost. No, the Rath was only one of them. There was some woman in Joburg, I forget her name. Then there was a lawyer in Pietermaritzburg. I know them because I used to go, for some reason I ended up being the spokesperson because of the conference chairmanship. So I had debates with this lawyer in Pietermaritzburg. He was another great advisor. He wrote a book or two about drugs. He was another great advisor of Thabo. And you know, when you ask me about how do you speak to such people, you cannot. It was, for me, it was like trying to smash a fly with a sledgehammer. That lawyer was just hopeless, you know. You can probably argue some sort of pseudo-scientific case against drugs or so, but he just wasn't in that league. So it became pointless. But I had a lot of debates and discussions with these people. But there were quite a few of them, But I think that episode and all the connotations for the corruption of political power, the silence of the masses, the cowardice of the scientific profession, the cowardice of politicians who are absolutely brave during a fight for freedom, all of that, I mean, and the perpetuation of views in a modern period which are manifestly absurd. The pervasiveness of this view from one man at the top and his cronies right through the whole landscape of our political and social environment. I mean, it's a massive episode. Nobody's ever thought. I have a son who's a writer. He writes novels and all. I wish he would write about it, but he's not interested. He says it's too obvious, but it is obvious, but it still deserves something. It was the acid test in some ways, hey? Some ways. Not really. I mean, the acid test is also the poverty, the persistence of inequality, the rottenness of government right down to municipal level, the corruption, all of that. Those are all acid tests, but This one captured something which was really broad, and because it pitched this massive historical culture of science which is uncontested in most parts of the world. It can't be contested. It's what makes these lights work and your camera work and makes us survive beyond the age of 40 or so. Pitched it against these dark and primitive views. So it said a lot. So in that way, if I was a playwright or so, that is what I'd love to write about. Corruption is common all over. Municipalities are rotten all over. But this is almost, I can't think of an equivalent. I looked it up. I looked up Bush. And Bush messed around with science in the US, but it wasn't of this order. But in the most the most startling paradox of all, Mbeki thought he was like Galileo. He thought he was a single man speaking the truth, and the rest of us were persecuting him. So he turned. That's how he interpreted history. He didn't understand that he was not Galileo.
Co-opted the role of the.
That's right. That's what he did.
You know, as if he were
Absolutely, being person.
to power.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's just astonishing that he was so deluded, and that all those people around him couldn't see that, or did they see it and didn't want to see it? I don't know. You know, those people are my friends now. You know, they are still my friends, and I sit on this president's planning commission, and then many of them, all of them are there. They were there in that time too. I do. I mean, it does. I mean, I can never forget it. I wish I could write about it back, because I love literature, but I can't. I mean, I don't have the time. But it doesn't. I feel offended about certain. Helen Reese's incident upset me enormously, because she portrays herself as something different now. And I'm offended by that sort of thing. I'm offended by the new acolytes of the ANC, whom I knew in those old days. They were cowardly creatures who were just interested in making money from the apartheid government. They happened to be Indian, they happened to be white, and they happened to be African. I'm offended by those people. These people, you know, what must I say? How can I think about Mac Maharaj? He's a man I've always admired. I cannot think of many people in the struggle who were tortured by the security as he was. He gave up a lifetime. And there must be an explanation why he didn't speak up.
Yeah, all those silent voices.
Yes. Yeah. What happened? What took away this courage? It couldn't be just the money, surely. Maybe they had come into this new government, this new democracy. They had sacrificed so much by exile and so much. And they had to make a success of it. Because, you know, as you say, the rest of the Western world would have said, well, there's another black government, there's more corruption and stupidity and ignorance. So they had to make a success. And maybe their commitment to that national the achievement of a national democracy overrode the peccadillos of an AIDS conference. Of AIDS and the views of science. And well, in their eyes.
Yeah.
So you have this massive project for which people had given up their lives, and here comes this dispute, which is a little abstracted in their eyes about science and reality. And all of them were trying to sort out. Mac was doing transport, and somebody was doing defense, and somebody was trying to do education. I suppose they had and they didn't want this to interfere. Maybe that would be the more generous interpretation of what happened. It's probably true, I think. I never thought of it that way before. But if I wanted to be realistic and not to keep blaming people and I don't like the word forgive because it makes me sound like a Muslim or Christian. Reconcile. Yeah. I can reconcile to it. I really don't feel I do feel for some people, as I said, but that's a personal weakness.
Yeah.
I feel angered by some people, but I should be angry against most or all of them, but I'm not. I mean, the person I respect very much is Praveen Gordon, who was with me in the struggle from the beginning. But in a way, he was a little out of it. He was the SARS, he was running the revenue service. He wasn't really a minister. So. No, I could never do that to these people. So he's stuck. It's an existential problem. Because what had happened up to now, the role of many brave scientists and all the scientific struggles and those arguments has been overridden by the mass mobilization of the TACs and others, which is important, of course it is. But it made intellectuals and others look as if they were sitting back, whereas many of us had a history of struggle for a long, long time, which put many lives at risk, and it flowed over into this AIDS debate. And there were very many people who worked very hard. And there was such a massive silence around it. And there's a difference between an organization like TAC fighting through the courts and individuals, and a few individuals fighting on their own against the presidency.